want to talk today about how Beau, fifth column, Justin King, keeps saying that the US has no leverage over Israel and how he justifies that, because it's quite interesting and in some ways very telling. Okay, so this one is from the 24th of October. So it was the first one that I found where he kind of said that.
And again, realistically, I know everybody in the world looks at the U.S. and well, they call the shots. Not here. Not here. The opinions that matter are in Tel Aviv and Tehran. That's where the critical decisions about this are going to be made. So there's also probably an element.
Yeah, so that's kind of where he says it there. And then there's this one where he does go into a fair amount more detail about it.
The topic of leverage has come up. And it's in the context of what leverage does the U.S. have that it could use to influence Israel. Most people who are in favor of this, they point to the aid the U.S. provides. That's not leverage. It's not enough. I know that they're one of the biggest supporters, like our biggest recipients of U.S. aid. However, they also have a massive military expenditure of their own. They're not dependent on that aid.
So here we have the first justification, okay? He claims that Israel has enough of its own, doesn't need the US to give it its aid. I find it quite interesting that Israel is actually the biggest recipient of US aid. Like, it's a fairly rich country. It's certainly a lot richer than a number of the countries surrounding it. And yet, for some reason, it's the biggest recipient of US aid. Bit weird that. You'd think, you know, some rather poorer countries, some really poor countries would need more aid. But apparently, Israel is the biggest recipient. Now, obviously, he's being quite disingenuous when he says that, because, you know, if the US were to say, we're going to cut off your aid forever if you don't stop this, that is leverage, because obviously they want to be able to carry on getting their aid. Now, it might be the case that they've got plenty of weapons to be going on with, but they don't want to run out of them. They don't want to get to a point where they've got no more weapons to kill Palestinians with. So that's very disingenuous of him to start with. Yes.
So, as much as people like to look at it as if it is leverage, it's not. And people have asked what leverage the U.S. actually has, and I'll be honest, it's been really hard to come up with something. Because most of the leverage the U.S. has is, it's like a nuclear option. Not actually nuclear, it's something that is so dramatic, it would alter the balance of power in the Middle East.
And we're kind of getting to it here, like, why? It's, I mean, you could call it a nuclear option, you could say, oh, it's too much for us to lose all our power, but they don't need that power, it's just what they want. So, this is about their own self-interests, clearly.
Israel knows the U.S. isn't going to do that. So it's not really leverage. And it's been hard trying to come up with something to answer that question. I want to read you something. I have been emphatic with Israel's leaders that extremist violence against Palestinians in the West Bank must stop, and that those committing the violence must be held accountable. This is Biden.
So we've got your pro-Biden propaganda here. He does that a lot. He's very into pro-Biden, being pro-Biden.
Goes on. The United States is prepared to take our own steps, including issuing visa bans against extremists attacking civilians in the West Bank. That's leverage. It may not sound like a lot, but it is.
Spoiler alert, it's not actually that much.
Mainly because this is something that the U.S. can actually do. A lot of the other things that the U.S. has as leverage, it can't do it because it would disrupt the balance of power in the Middle East. That's something that's actionable.
And I don't think I can stress enough how he feels like he's pushing this line that the US should have the balance of power as well. Like, as far as he's concerned, it's right for the US to have the balance of power there. And, you know, he's kind of framing it as we all should think it's right that the US should have the balance of power there. And that's why Israel can do basically what it likes, because Israel is basically the US representative in the region.
So, let's talk about signaling. First, and this can't be, this part can't be missed. This is the most pressure the U.S. has put on Israel in a very, very, very long time. And I don't mean doing it. I mean just saying it. That's very public.
This is just so little, that's the thing. And it's kind of very telling that basically the US never tries to tell Israel to do anything right.
And it's sending the message that, A, the U.S. is no longer going to look the other way when it comes to settlements.
Yeah, I just find it, so he's talking about the settlements in the West Bank, right? So he's not even talking about Gaza here. They might in a minute. But I found it quite interesting. That's on November the 19th. We're now on December the 19th, right? And there's been some pretty horrific things happening since. Like, I don't know if the premature babies were found dead after the IDF, the Israeli occupation force, forced people to leave and claimed they would be taken care of, and then just left them to die. But it's definitely before the most recent really horrific thing of a number of Palestinians who were in tents outside a hospital were bulldozed into the ground. Their bodies torn up and they're buried alive. It was horrific. And that's happened since all of this. So that's signalling. It's not done much good, has it?
And B, it's something that U.S. policy has now determined is going to be something that they try to enforce. Sanctions, you know, type of thing on individual people, not the country as a whole.
Yeah, I think it's important to note here that they're still not going to sanction the country. It's just like individual settlers in the West Bank, essentially. And it's not even that many settlers. It's really not a huge deal because, you know, there's always more settlers. There's always more people willing to come and be settlers. So
and the other signal that's here is those lines on that map, they're real and they need to be respected. That's the signal.
I guess he's talking about Gaza and the West Bank, the lines such as they exist, which Israel have been consistently violating.
There's also a little bit of, hey, times are changing and you're going to have to change with it. It's another piece of it. All of those are signals that are easy to see. I'm going to step away from just the normal stuff for a second because there's something kind of interesting here. If you're reading the tea leaves, it seems like Biden might be entertaining the idea of a multinational force to enforce those borders. You know, people talked, there was a lot of conversation about a multinational force afterward. Seemed odd because, I mean, I can't imagine a lot of countries raising their hand when the question is who wants to go in and, in essence, occupy that area. That's a big ask. However, if that multinational force wasn't there for that purpose, there might be a lot more takers. I would keep your ears open for the phrases multinational force or internationalizing the security responsibilities.
Okay, so that's he kind of whitters on about that for a bit. Now, there has been talk of an international task force since then, but that's really only in response to the Yemenis taking ships and attacking ships and basically making it impossible for ships to go past them to the Red Sea, to use the Suez Canal, so they're all having to go around Africa. It's mostly Israeli ships, but also anything that's going to Israel. I think they've kind of got to the point where they're just saying, no ships until you stop bombing Gaza. And I'm pretty sure there's other conditions as well, but that's what's happened. And it's only in response to that. It's not, the internationalising hasn't been in response to the horrific human rights abuses and massacres or anything like that. Okay, so he talks a little bit more about that here, I think.
Most common one that has come in over the last few hours has been, okay, so if Israel doesn't need the aid and they're not dependent on that aid from the U.S., why is the U.S. giving it to them? Right? Makes sense. Why does a politician stand out in front of the groundbreaking of some infrastructure project that they voted for? Or sometimes they even voted against, but they go out there and take credit for it anyway, right? Stand there with a hard hat and a shovel. Why do they do that? Because they're spending money in a way that people like, and it gets them votes. It's kind of that simple. If you're younger, please understand the default setting for U.S. politicians for decades was the U.S. supports Israel.
So that's basically what he's saying. He's saying the only reason that Israel gets so much aid is because of all the votes in it. Now, he kind of never mentions groups like AIPAC, which fund candidates for the Senate and for Congress generally to represent their interests, basically the interests of Israel. In fact, he never mentions that I've noticed. So he doesn't mention that there's actually a lot of money in it for individual senators, individual House members, representative members. You know, he never mentions that. He just says the votes, and yes, there are votes in it, and yes, that has gone down, that is going down, as he's pointing out here. But he's being deeply disingenuous to say it's just about votes, because also, you know, the aid isn't just about votes, it's about power, it's about maintaining their power base in the Middle East, which he does even talk about. So,
an incredibly popular position, and providing aid, well, it played well. It wasn't a politically risky thing. So that's why, I mean, the aid for Israel is allocated out through a memorandum of understanding out until, I want to say, 2028. Our own military isn't funded out until 2028. It's about catching the votes. A lot of evangelical Christians, there's a whole bunch of demographics that are just steadfast in their support. That's what it was about. The shift that you're seeing now, understand, it's new. That is new. Politicians even remotely questioning it. It's new. That wasn't common. So it's really more about domestic politics. And when you look at the foreign policy side, somebody in the comments said that it was symbolic. Yeah, I mean, there's some truth to that. You know, it shows that the U.S. is with Israel and Israel is with the U.S. and all of that stuff, and that's important in that geopolitical card game that's going on over there. At the same time, I mean, that's kind of demonstrated by the joint research projects and military projects that go on. That's something that could be done with a treaty or just words. The money, it's about domestic politics more than anything.
So he's literally just trying to say it's domestic but he will also say later in other places that it's about maintaining the power base in the Middle East. He's being so disingenuous about this, it's disgusting. It really is.
So, the other question is, people are saying that Biden's administration is doing things behind the scenes. An example, it was the request. And I think a good way to do this and to show you how behind the scenes it kind of is right now you have a whole bunch of political commentators and even some politicians saying, fine, we'll give Israel aid, but we need to condition it. We need to put conditions on the aid that we're going to give Israel and say you can't do X with it. As an example, they would say, fine, you want to buy these rifles, we'll sell you these M16s, but you can't give them to settlers. Something like that.
So that's, as far as he's concerned, the extent, okay? There's the visa thing that was discussed in the other video where they're going to like ban certain settlers from going to the US, which, like, I don't think there are many settlers who are going to care that much about it, frankly. And then there's this. Oh, use your guns, don't give them to settlers. Pinky promise, go on, just don't. And this is so ridiculous. I mean, like, it would be easy enough for them to swap out, guns with the IDF, give the M16s to the IDF and then give the IDF's guns to, well, it's really occupation forces, guns to the settlers or whatever. And, like, Ben-Gvir has been giving out guns. It's well known that he's giving out guns to settlers anyway. So I don't know if they're the M16s, but it obviously doesn't matter that they've been told not to give M16s to settlers, because settlers are still getting guns and they are terrorising people in the West Bank. They are terrorising Palestinians in the West Bank. That's meant nothing.
Like that. Putting conditions on the aid. Biden did that 2 weeks ago. Didn't get a lot of press, didn't get a lot of fanfare. And probably that had to do with a whole lot of people who cover foreign policy looking at it and being like, what is this? And they didn't really know what to make of it. But the Israeli government wanted to purchase a bunch of M16s. And the Biden administration was like, yeah, okay, but you can't do this with them. It's stuff like that, and given the fact that that and his recent statement about the visa bans both deal with the same topic, it shows an intent. It's not haphazard, there's a plan. If you put the pieces together, it kind of looks like the administration's sitting there like, well, we can't stop this. Let's get the peace process restarted afterward.
Yeah, so this is just kind of ridiculous. It's just like tinkering around the edges of stuff that doesn't matter much and that can easily be I don't think they've got an American task force out in Israel checking that settlers aren't getting the M16s. Like, they haven't done anything like that. It's utterly ridiculous. Anyway, so this is the bit where he talks about... Now, there was a video about the UN vote. I'm not going to bother with that today. About the result of the vote. This is in the run-up to the vote, okay? So he says something utterly ridiculous here.
I would imagine that most people are going to say it's not going to happen. I am hopeful that the Security Council starts to take it a little bit more seriously.
So he's talking about the possibility of the UN applying pressure here, right? And he talks about hoping the UN will take it a little bit more seriously, as though the US doesn't just ride roughshod over whatever the UN wants to take seriously anyway. Absolutely disgusting. And this is also leverage, okay? This is also leverage that the US has over Israel. And he's mentioned it in another thing. Well, I brought it up in another one where he talks about the US being like a friend of Israel and being there to vote their way on in the UN. It's pretty disgraceful. They don't have to use their vote to veto anything against Israel. They can vote, they can abstain, or they can vote for it. They choose to veto everything that's curtailing Israel.
In related news, it's worth noting that Israeli officials, after their push south, described yesterday as the most intense fighting since the ground offensive started. There may be a little bit more willingness on the part of Israel as well. I do not believe that the move south is going to go smoothly. Their timeline exceeds the timeline that Blinken kind of indicated existed. So there's a lot.
So it's kind of a weird thing where he's basically saying, well, they might use the veto or they might not vote against it because of this issue that the Israeli occupation force are having with breaking into the south because they're rubbish and Hamas are beating their arses. They were supposed to have got to the south before this, really.
A lot of variables to this. I know that conventional wisdom says that the U.S. is going to veto anything like that and just allow Israel to do what it's doing. And the conventional wisdom may be correct. But I think there are enough variables at play right now to be hopeful for some other outcome. We will have to wait and see.
So he's basically, it's so ridiculous the way he's trying to say, oh, the US might not veto anything, any action against Israel. They might not veto a motion saying it's genocide that Israel are doing. It's so disingenuous. Everybody knows that this is... I can't imagine how anybody watching this actually thinks that he's... this is so ridiculous. And yes, it's sort of symbolic, like how are the UN going to... What's going to happen if... what would have happened if the UN had passed that resolution? I don't really know. I don't know how good the UN might be at stopping Israel from continuing to commit genocide, but it's quite ridiculous for him to be like, oh well, they might not just back up the Israel. So ridiculous. Anyway, so then we've got a little bit here.
This leads to the obvious question: if foreign policy is about power, and Israel is...
I am going to do, by the way, a video about the way he keeps talking about foreign policy. It really bugs me so much. I'm actually going to do a video just about that.
Becoming a liability, why doesn't the U.S. just do an about face and no longer be friends with Israel, right? It would make sense. It's long-term strategic planning for the region.
So this is where he's telling you why they aren't doing this, all right? It's not necessarily about votes in the US, about, you know, citizens of the US protesting or voting or anything like that. It's this.
That's the answer. We've been talking about it on the channel for years. The US wants to deprioritize the Middle East so it can look elsewhere. Cough, Africa, cough.
So when he talks about deprioritizing the Middle East, what he means is getting the Middle East basically under its heel, so it's got pretty much control over the Middle East. And I said in the previous video that, you know, the genocide in Gaza may well be part of it, and it may well be, because there's very sort of strong rumours, indications that, for example, they want to build a canal to rival the Suez Canal, because like having one canal, to be fair, like just having that one canal through Egypt is, you know, it's a bit problematic. You do kind of, you know, we saw that with the Ever Given blocking it accidentally. So I can understand why you'd want more than one canal, even if it wasn't like all about power or anything like that, right? But obviously they want to build the canal through Gaza. That's part of it. They want to build a canal to rival the Suez Canal through the Gaza Strip. And obviously they've got all these pesky people living there getting in the way of that, so they don't want that. And then of course you've got all the oil and gas that's underneath the Gaza Strip. And that's almost certainly what this is about, right? The reason that the US don't care about that, about the genocide in Gaza, the reason they're basically backing it, is because as far as they're concerned, they want their another canal that they've got control of, and they want all that oil and gas. And of course they want their power base.
That's the plan. In order for the US to deprioritize the Middle East, you have to have those poles of power: Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel.
Oh, and by the way, because he said Africa, cough, Africa or something. Now the thing is that what he's then saying is that basically they're going to expand their imperialist ambitions, basically. Once they feel like they've got the Middle East completely under their control, or, you know, East Asia, really, we should say. Once you've got that completely under their control, then they'll be moving on to Africa and exerting control over that. That's what he's indicating there.
For the US to maintain power, even though they're not active in the region, two of those countries have to be more aligned, leaning more towards the US. It's not going to be Iran. Even though the US wants to bring Iran out, Iran is going to align more with Russia or China. So in order to have the majority of the polls, the United States needs Saudi Arabia and Israel to be supportive to some degree, to lean more their way. Again, we're not talking about friends. Countries don't have friends, they have interests. So they need those interests to align. That's why the US can't just be like, you're not our friend anymore. Because the US needs Israel for long-term planning. At the same time, the US can't risk losing the Arab world. So there's this balancing act that's occurring. The problem is US diplomatic efforts they really are trying to mitigate harm right now. The problem is it is very slow moving. It's not going quickly. And the Arab world is sitting there looking at it and going, okay, great, some relief got in and you got a 4-hour pause, whoopee. The US can say, hey, we're trying to do X, Y, and Z as well. But the United States doesn't exactly have a track record of being totally truthful when it comes to the Middle East, right? We can forgive the Arab publics for not just taking the U.S. at its word here, because sometimes past performance does predict future results.
I think something I forgot to mention in the Iran video was that he does actually talk as though he does this thing that I've mentioned actually in my first video about him, where he kind of conflates states with the citizens of that state. So he's kind of trying to conflate basically Saudi Arabia with the government of the citizens of Saudi Arabia with the government of Saudi Arabia, and the citizens of Iran with the government of Iran. And kind of saying that, because this video is basically about how the Arab world looks at what's happening in Israel and how the US is dealing with it. And the thing is, doesn't really matter which part of the Arab world you're looking at. They're basically all very unhappy about this. There's protests pretty much anywhere that protests are allowed. I mean, I don't think there's any in Saudi Arabia, but it's an extremely repressive regime. There was one that was allowed in, was it in Dubai? It was one of those ones where like protests actually are illegal, but they managed to have some sort of rally under, it was something else. I can't remember. It was like some national celebration or something, football game or something like that. I can't remember. But if they were allowed to protest, they almost certainly would be. They're just not allowed to. Like any Arab country where they are allowed to protest, there's huge protests against the genocide. So it's very much the Arab governments that are allowing it to happen, not the citizens. But he's kind of conflating them, and he's sort of the thing is that the Arab world in general just does not trust the US, just generally. You've got Saudi Arabia that's friendly, aligned with the US government, but that's purely about like their power. It's got nothing to do with, liking the US, and it's got nothing to do with the citizens of Saudi Arabia, really.
So the US is in a situation where, from a foreign policy standpoint, it can't come out too hard against Israel because it's going to need Israel in the future. But it also can't do nothing. The diplomats are saying they have to fix the gap between what's actually happening when it comes to U.S. diplomatic efforts and explaining that they are trying to mitigate harm and the public perception.
Okay, so I think, so basically this is like, so we've gone from him saying the US has no leverage over Israel, okay, to him explaining that, well, we could, but we like them being there, so we're not going to. That's basically, and he's gone through some really quite ridiculous arguments about, voting and completely, ignoring stuff like APAC. So, this just is, it's really terrible. It's another example of him basically doing pro-government propaganda, pro-US government propaganda, pro-Israel propaganda. Because he knows damn well that the US could stop it if they wanted to, and that they're just choosing not to. And it's disgusting. And the vast majority, and I'm sure like most people out there do actually know that this is the case, but they're just, a lot of people, like Justin here, are very comfortable with the US taking that position and allowing genocide. And that's how it is, really. So you need to be very careful. This is like, he is not pro-Palestinian, okay? A person who is pro-Palestinian would not be talking like this, okay? Would not be using this disingenuous arguments. This guy is, it just drives, it's ridiculous how he just has so much, on the left, he has so much influence. So many people are just agreeing with what he's saying. He is manufacturing consent for genocide. He's doing that because he's pro the establishment of the US government, okay? Whether he's being paid for it or not, it's what he's doing, okay? Whether he's a Fed or not, it is what he is doing, okay? That is what he's doing. And it sort of doesn't matter whether he's a Fed or not, because it's what he's doing.